Hi, everybody, and welcome to Dr. Archer's Lectures. In this lecture, we're going to move away from microeconomics, the things that involve only the individual and the firm, which we talked about in the first few weeks. We're going to move away from macroeconomics, things that affect the entire economy, and we're going to branch out even further to look at international trade. And so as we consider international trade, there are a few basics for us to look at first. So let's just dive right in right here. The first one is comparative advantage. Ooh, does that sound familiar at all? Remember in week 1 when we talked about comparative advantage and opportunity cost? Comparative advantage goes to the country which has the lowest opportunity cost. And you will remember from week 1 that opportunity cost is what you give up for the decision that you make. If we have a factory and we have 10 workers and they can make either televisions or video games, and we put all 10 of them to work making televisions, then we give up our video game production. We don't have any workers left to make those video games. We have given that up. That's our opportunity cost. So when we think about international trade, we're going to think about it in terms of which country has the lowest opportunity cost. I know we hear a ton about cheap labor in certain countries and substandard conditions in certain countries, and it makes it so it's hard for the U.S. to compete. And all of those things are true up to a point, but the real determinant of who trades with who is who has the lowest opportunity cost, who gives up the least in order to produce this good or service. Absolute advantage, on the other hand, is what we were just talking about. Absolute advantage comes from lowest resource cost. So if I can build this for $20 and you can build it for $10, you have the lowest resource cost. So you have the absolute advantage. If I can build it for 20, but you can build it for 10, you have the absolute advantage. Does that mean necessarily that you also have the comparative advantage? It's really two different ways of considering cost. If I can build it for 20, but you can build it for 10, you absolutely have the lowest resource cost and you have the absolute advantage. However, if you're giving up building jet fighters, which you can sell for millions of dollars, that's your opportunity cost. And if I'm giving up building shoes, which I can sell for $20 a pair, that's my opportunity cost, then I have the lower opportunity cost. I have the comparative advantage. So even though you have the absolute advantage, I have the comparative advantage, because these are two distinctly different ways of looking at cost. So who trades with who is determined by comparative advantage. What do you have to give up in order to produce this to offer for trade? That's the question. And countries are going to specialize in producing goods for trade in which they have the lowest opportunity cost, in which they have the comparative advantage. So under that line of thinking, if there's free trade throughout the world and we can all trade with everyone, then goods are going to be produced in the countries where there's the lowest opportunity cost. That means that whoever's producing those shoes is going to be producing them at the lowest opportunity cost. They're not giving up that much to produce those shoes. And they can produce a lot of them because they don't have to give up that much to do so. That's going to lead to greater total output. Every country's producing the things that they have the lowest opportunity cost. So we can have greater total output among all countries. If we have greater total output, then we can satisfy more wants and needs. If we satisfy more wants and needs, everybody in all trading partners has a higher standard of living, life is good, and we found nirvana. So why isn't everything done that way? Why don't we simply make these calculations and trade accordingly? Why aren't we maximizing efficiency? Well, that's because when I say that all trading partners have a greater standard of living, it's true, it's absolutely true, but there are individuals within those countries that are hurt by trade. And that's one of the things that we have to consider. There is pressure on Congress to protect, to close our borders to trade. And that's not only true here, but in all countries. There's a certain amount of pressure to protect. And one of the reasons for that is to save jobs. Oh my goodness, we hear tons about this in all political campaigns, right? International trade is taking all of our jobs. And to some extent, that's true. If another country can produce this at a lower opportunity cost and we let them do that, then the workers who do that work here are going to be out of work until they find something else. Look in discussion question 1, and there's an additional question there that I've put in about, did China eat our jobs? It's a very interesting look at how that has worked with China in the last few years. I think you'll find that very interesting. So that's one reason. Although everybody overall benefits from trade, some people don't. In fact, some people are hurt by trade, and the people who are hurt petition Congress to pass laws to restrict the trading and to relieve their suffering. The second reason is national security. Now, if our military proposed buying our jet fighters from another country, China or even Canada or the UK, do you think that's a good idea? Probably not. You just can't trust someone else to take care of that in the same way that you would. There's risk that the supply would be interrupted. There's risk that the quality wouldn't be as good as it would be if we did it. We just don't want to trust that. One of the questions is, how far does that go? No, of course you don't want other countries producing our jet fighters. You probably don't want other countries producing our rifles and sidearms that our military carry. What about their uniforms, shirts and pants? Would it be okay then? What about their shoes? Would that be okay? What about food and materials for the kitchens in the military? It gets murky. It gets into gray areas as you go down that scale. But at least at some levels, there's a good, strong argument to be made for the need to produce these things domestically for reasons of national security. Then there's the problem of dumping. Some other countries, or other countries in general, can sometimes sell goods into our country at prices lower than they sell them in their own country. They just cut the price when they bring them here. And of course, the US isn't the only victim of dumping, and I don't want to give that impression. We do it also. But when another country sells goods here at a lower price than they would sell them in their own country, that's called dumping. And what it does, it hurts and it ultimately destroys the domestic industries that have to compete with those very low priced imports. So you can see where that would be a problem. And you can also see where once those domestic industries are destroyed, the country that's importing these goods very, very cheaply is going to raise those prices. So we'll be at their mercy at that point. That's a problem. And then you have the whole case of infant industries. When a new industry starts up, it takes a while to get going. It cannot compete head to head with established industries in other countries. And so, in many cases, the US government, Congress might choose to protect those industries, let them get a start before they have to compete. It's a good idea, and yet the question then becomes, how long is an infant industry an infant? We have the example of furniture manufacturers who've had this protection since the 1700s. Is that infant industry ever going to grow up? It's a question. So here are some of the ways that we may choose to limit the amount of imports coming into our country. And we're going to look at these ranked from the most extreme and the most pervasive all the way down to the least invasive, the least persuasive. So the strongest thing you can do is an absolute embargo. This simply says we prohibit imported goods from your country, period. Cuba has been under an embargo for a long time, although we've opened our doors to a few goods, but still Cuba is very much on that embargo list. Iran has been an embargoed country, although again, we're starting to negotiate that and loosen those a little bit. North Korea is still an embargoed country. We don't import goods from North Korea. And these embargoes are extreme measures, and they usually have to do with things other than trade itself. They usually have to do with, for instance, in the case of North Korea, the nuclear program there, or some kind of diplomatic or military issue between the two countries. The next most restrictive barrier is a tariff. A tariff is simply a tax that's imposed on the imported goods as they come into our country. If I can import something for $10, the price here would be $10, but I impose a $10 tax on it, now it's going to have to sell for $20 to cover that $10 import tax, the tariff. And at $20, that brings it more in line with the pricing of the domestically produced goods. So you can bring in these products as many as you want. It's fine, but it's going to cost you. And you're going to have to pay that difference, that tariff. This is an excellent way for the government to make money on this whole program. The tariffs that are collected are tax revenues to the government. And it allows our trading partners to trade in, to import goods to us. But by raising the price, it reduces the amount of those goods that will be demanded in this country. So it's not looked on very favorably by our trading partners, as you would guess. The next one is quota. Quota works the opposite direction. Quota simply says you can bring them in here, you could sell them at any reasonable price, but you can only bring so many. So it doesn't fool with the price, but it just says there's a limit on how many you can bring in. This pushes the whole supply curve to the left, and if the demand curve stays constant, that means that the equilibrium price on these goods in this market is going to go up. So again, we have the price of the goods going up. That makes it easier for our domestic firms to compete. And that's another way that we reduce trade. Now, once again, circling back, all of these are ways to reduce trade. And we just talked about that as a nation, as an economy, our best bet is to have free trade. Everybody trade with everybody. Everybody produce the goods where you have comparative advantage, where you can produce at the lowest opportunity cost, and therefore you're going to have more output not only in this country but worldwide. You're going to have a higher standard of living not only in this country but worldwide. But there are reasons why people resist this logic, and these barriers to trade are ways that they limit that. Some more barriers to trade, or some more considerations for barriers to trade. It can often seem like a really good idea. You know, if the Chinese are going to bring in all those cheap goods, well, we'll just slap a tariff on it. If Mexico's going to bring in all this cheap stuff, well, we'll just slap a tariff on it. But no country is going to sit still and allow us to impose barriers without imposing barriers of their own. And virtually all companies within the United States export their goods and services to other countries. Our companies in the US would be hurt if other countries retaliated by imposing similar trade barriers. Not only that, but international trade decreases, so the standard of living in both countries falls, and you have less output in the world as a whole. None of this is good. None of this is good, and these are the results of barriers to trade. Free trade is good for both countries because it ultimately reduces prices. It increases total production because everybody's producing those things where they have the lowest opportunity cost. And if you increase production, then you can increase consumption. We can all have more of everything, and we can have a higher standard of living. Sometimes countries are wise and they talk reasonably with each other, and they reach voluntary trade restraints. Maybe the two countries settle into trade talks and they say, I can see where when I export so many shoes to your country, it hurts your industry. And you can see where when you export sugar to my country, it hurts our industry. So maybe we can agree that we'll both export a little less so that both countries can do a little better. This is voluntary restraint agreements. The two countries simply agree to reduce the volume of trade. You still have the problems with reducing trade. Restricting trade is going to reduce the standard of living of both, but done in small increments and on a voluntary basis and everything. This is probably the most reasonable way to do that. And then you have your non-tariff barriers. These are measures that look like they have nothing to do with trade, but in fact, they are trade restrictions. So when a truck that is delivering goods in Mexico wants to cross the border into the United States and deliver goods here, and we say, no, 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 we aren't comfortable with your safety standards. It could be about safety standards, or it could be simply a way to protect the U.S. trucking industry. That is one of the non-tariff barriers. Likewise, different kinds of licensing restrictions. Generally speaking, doctors, lawyers, people like that can't just cross borders willy-nilly. They would have to be licensed in the country that they're going to. Licensing restrictions can be problematic. And sometimes even the use of the product is a problem. Until very recently, Japan would not allow U.S. beef to be imported there because of mad cow disease back in the 80s and 90s. And so that was a safety precaution as far as they were concerned. But that was also just a use of product standards. They won't accept our beef because of the way that we raise our beef. So all of these can be just exactly what they appear to be. A few years ago, there was a case where toys were imported from China that used lead paint. Well, in this country, we don't allow lead paint on children's toys. So that was a true safety regulation. But sometimes trade barriers can be disguised as safety regulations, product standards, licensing restrictions, and so on. And so that's Dr. Archer's lectures for today, the discussion of international trade. Come see me again next time when we will be talking about foreign exchange rates, the monetary exchange rates. I look forward to seeing you then on Dr. Archer's lecture.